Welcome to the Full Scottish this Sunday, the 21st of March. I hope the weather's as nice wherever you are as it is here. My name is Brian Liddy, and welcome, as I said, welcome to the Full Scottish. Today we've got two guests with us. First of all, we've got Councillor Elena Witham. Elena is the Deputy Leader of the East Ayrshire Council and the SNP candidate for Carrick and Cumnock and Doon Valley. Alongside her, we have Matt Campbell-Sturges, and he is the national convener of the English Scots for Yes, and is also an SNP campaigner. I'm sorry for that stilted introduction there, but welcome to you both. And today in Scotland, I can give you an update on coronavirus as it was at 2 p.m. yesterday. As of then, there were 488 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There have been 8 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, sadly. 367 people were in hospital on Friday night, 31 of whom were in intensive care. 2,085,525 people have received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, while 207,028 have received their second dose. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,769,144 people in Scotland have been tested. Of these, 1,556,147 tests were confirmed negative. Of those, 212,997 tests were positive. 7,552 patients have tested, who have tested positive to date have sadly died. So our first question is about the Scottish Parliament, which has passed the United Nations Children's Convention for the Rights of the Child. This is a landmark for children's rights. It means that Scotland is to become the first devolved nation in the world to directly incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Children into domestic law. So Scotland has now joined a small and quite select group of countries to have done so, and it looks like it's going to have the potential to transform children's lives in Scotland. Eleanor, can I ask, do you have any, I think you were involved in this, do you have anything that you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think when we look at, the UK government's decisions this week to actually decide to spend millions of pounds on increasing their nuclear arsenal, and also to actually start to criminalise, the children of gypsy travellers by invoking horrendous trespass laws. I think that, contrasting this with our Scottish Parliament taking a decision to ratify, and actually, put into our Scots law, United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child, this is actually game changing. This puts us at the vanguard of making sure that everything that we decide in this country has children and young people right at its heart. Whether that's decisions on the environment, whether that's decisions on transport, listening to the lived experience of young people is hugely important. Down in East Ayrshire, we actually have a youth cabinet, and that's a shadow cabinet for our own cabinet decision making body. So we've already started to actually take into account, the wishes of children locally. We have our Scottish Youth Parliament. They've been at the vanguard of this as well. One of our own SYPs here in East Ayrshire, Liam Fowley, he was tweeting about this, for weeks. This is something that they have worked on. And for us here, in Scotland, this is an amazing progressive move. And it actually shows massive difference between our Parliament in Scotland and what our government's doing here, and what the Tories are doing in the UK Parliament.
Thank you for that, Eleanor. Math, as you're from English English people for
English Scots for
yes.
yes.
I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Do you think this? Why isn't this the same kind of legislation appearing from Westminster? Do you think? Why has this been something that the Scottish government is having to take on its own?
I think it's perhaps symbolic of the fact that Scotland's Parliament and government are very intent on embedding in the very core framework of, as Elena said, the very core framework of Scottish civic life, the rights and responsibilities for everyone. And this is where you see progress on things like the children, well, the bill, because incorporating that convention into Scots law at the very base means that everything, as Elena said, transport, environment issues, everything has to go through the prism of how will this affect children, will this respect children's rights? Whereas in Westminster, they're far less centred on the needs of the population and the needs of children and the needs of the people, and far more centred on what makes money for their friends. Because that seems to be everything that Westminster care about. Every decision they seem to take seems to be based on, will this be good for my pals in the city? Will this allow some of my friends to bid on contracts? That seems to be all that Westminster cares about. It's particularly bad with the Tories, obviously, in the last 15 years. But going back further than that, Westminster has always seemed to put the needs of the city and business over the needs of the average people. That's been a flaw. Perhaps it's because of the Lords. Perhaps it's just because England, in parts of it, is slightly more right-leaning than Scotland is. We do have right-wing people here, obviously, as well. But the fact is that the Scottish Parliament has shown from the outset since 1999 to be more focused on what people in Scotland need, what people in Scotland want. And that can only be a good thing going forward, that this isn't the end of the journey. The convention being embedded in Scots law is great, but this is not the end of the journey for children's rights. We need to do more. We need to embed them into all parts of society. We need to make sure that, as with everything, decisions are made for children, with children involved, with young people involved in the process. Nothing for us without us, as the saying goes.
So it's a strong start by the Scottish government, and certainly much to be welcomed, I suppose, especially in times of COVID and how it's affecting children. Let's move on to the domestic abuse bill for victims, which is another piece of groundbreaking legislation that's been passed by Holyrood, giving more powers to the police and courts to protect people at risk of domestic abuse. This is a major change. Apparently, in the past, if there was an incident of domestic abuse, then what usually happened is the person or the people being abused, they would be taken away to a place of safety. And Holyrood now seems to have flipped that, and it would be the person abusing the others that would be asked to step aside or move away. Eleanor, again, can I come to you first? What do you have to say about this?
I could probably fill the entire remaining 50 minutes talking about this, because I worked for Women's Aid for over a decade, and I was one of those workers that actually was privileged enough to be able to support women and children who came into refuge, and the circumstances, Brian, as you've just described them, often arriving in a refuge situation with nothing except for the clothes that they stood in. And this is something that I've been campaigning for about 15 years, and I've recently worked hand in hand with Scottish Women's Aid and the Housing Minister to actually, and the Justice Minister, to figure out how do we actually make this monumental change so that the rights are remaining with the person who is being abused, and they're not being further traumatised by having to leave their property and everything behind and start all over again. Several years ago, there was a women's project in Fife that actually did an in-depth piece of work on this and published a report. And really, it's one of the key lines from that report was, "Why is it always about him? Why are we always the one that have to leave?" So this is monumentally important, because what it will do is actually allow the police to come in and give emergency orders that prevent the abuser from returning and protect usually the women, because this is the leading cause of women's homelessness in Scotland, and this is why we want to change it, but leave the women and any children that she may have in the household, and then apply to the a barring order that will be ongoing on a permanent basis. So this is a radical step forward in terms of protecting the rights of those who are facing domestic abuse, and something that absolutely has to be welcomed with open arms because, as I said before, this is the leading cause of women's homelessness, and it's something that's entirely preventable with these types of laws in place.
Thank you. Math, I'm trying to put this into some kind of perspective. But I'm just thinking something you mentioned in your previous answer, which kind of implied that there might be some kind of a cultural difference between Scotland and other countries. Again, I mean, it's almost the same question to you. Why do you think Scotland is forging ahead? I suppose what I'm thinking is that at the moment Scotland tends to appear in the news mostly around certain inquiries that are taking the headlines at the moment, when really there are so many other good things happening in Scotland, and yet they seem to be ignored. Is there anything that you think that we can do to maybe change that?
Well, I mean, obviously, as Elena said, I'm not going to try and cover the domestic abuse law because I am nowhere near the expert that Elena is. I've had friends that have faced domestic abuse. I've helped get a woman out of that situation, and she literally had the clothes on her back. She couldn't even go back in, and the police refused to intervene because it's a civil matter. That's the sort of thing this bill looks to change, and that's a great thing. But in terms of what we're doing differently in Scotland, I mean, I've lived in Scotland my entire adult life. I moved here when I was 18, so I've seen the difference from when I was young to now. But Scotland's moved in their 18 years too. And what's happening in the rest of the UK is maybe more symbolic of the fact that in parts of England they vote Tory and they get a Tory government. And, shocker, they're Tories. They don't care about the things that more progressive left-wing people actually do care about. So I think that it's not this idea of Scottish exceptionalism. We need to get away from that. Scotland's got the same problems as the rest of the UK. Scotland's got some of the same problems as the rest of Europe and countries across the globe. Domestic abuse is a horrific problem that affects women and children and some men as well all over the world. So we're not exceptional in that regard. But getting these sorts of bills passed, getting this sort of support in place is important to try and end that culture of violence. I mean, in the West Coast particularly, we've got problems with sectarianism. You can actually look at the crime stats for domestic abuse and you can actually say, yep, that was a football game, that was a football game, that was a football, because you can see the spikes, because that's just a cultural thing of certain parts of the population get drunk, watch football, beat their wife. That's something that absolutely needs to end. It needs to change. We need to change the culture. We need to make sure that children grow up knowing this is not acceptable, this is not normal. So it's a cultural journey and a societal journey as well as legislation. You can't pass laws to stop things happening. We have hundreds of laws and every day they're broken. So we need to change the culture to stop the abuse. That's something I think that's critical in these sorts of policy changes, because it as Elena said, this bill puts the onus on the abusers to find somewhere else to go. It puts the onus on them having to leave rather than the victim having to not only break a relationship and get out of a violent situation, but also having to find a new place to live, having to worry about their children, having to worry about schooling, having to worry about have they got clothes even. That's where this shift changes. I think a brilliant thing. And again, it comes back to nothing for us without us, because Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland and others have been saying this change needs to happen for a good while. And it's happened because they've said it, nothing for us without us. So I think this is a positivity about government being closer to the people. And I think that's possibly where we really do come with Hollywood, is that the government is closer to the people. So it's more reactive to the needs of the people. The House of Lords is 800 miles away, and from parts of Scotland, it's full of old crusty men that have no connection with modern life, yet they get a say on UK legislation. Hollywood is, no more than a couple of hours drive for a good amount of Scotland. It's, filled with MSPs that are all elected. It's filled with MSPs that live locally to you, so it's a lot closer to the people.
Yes, so
I'll stop waffling there.
no, no, not at all. It's all good. So yeah, another strong statement of intent from the Scottish government there. Elena, I'm, I'm just wondering how do you think this new legislation would maybe impact on women's refuges? As it's, will they still be required, or are you hoping that? I'll let you answer that. Do you think they will still be required?
I think that we'll absolutely always need to have safe spaces for people to go to, because it's not that every single woman is going to be able to, excuse me, frog in my throat, is going to
You
be able to
okay?
leave it at that exact moment. And, sometimes there's going to be an overwhelming need for the safety, and that's going to actually have to be, result in a woman going into situation. I think what we have to recognise as well is that Scotland just passed what's been described as gold standard domestic abuse law, a couple of years ago, and this bill, the protection bill, is coming from that place where we actually have, decided that as a country we view coercive control as just as damaging to those who are experiencing domestic abuse as physical violence, whether that's financial control, sexual control as well. So as Math said, we really are looking at this in the round as an entire country to say this isn't acceptable anymore, because we have about 60,000 recorded incidences of domestic abuse in Scotland every single year. This is a massive cultural shift that we have to make as a nation. And I think that bringing these laws to the fore are going to actually address that in a cultural way, that shift that we need to make. But at the moment, we're still going to require specialist women's services, in the form of women's refuges and in the form of rape crisis, because there's always going to be a need for women to have to leave where there's extreme violence that they're maybe not going to be protected. But what this bill does is it gives them the breathing space to be able to make informed decisions without having to enter the homeless system, and lose everything, that they hold dear, including their neighbours, their friends, their families, and their possessions. So yeah, I think we still need for refuge. We still have to make sure that they're adequately funded as well across the country.
Okay. And as a staying with you, Eleanor, as a councillor, how do you think this new legislation would affect your day-to-day work or the council's day-to-day business?
Right across the country, we have really strong violence partnerships that work with the local authority, women's services in the area, and all of our community planning partners, including the police service. And something like this, the protective order, means that those services can start to work in a more proactive way to start to get the message to women that this is something you can choose to do. If you choose to stay in your home, we can now support you, and that means that housing departments across the country as well are going to change the way that they're operating, and because obviously it's incumbent upon them to decide if they can actually offer a managed move for a woman where that is the thing that's required. She maybe can't stay in the house that she's in, but instead of entering to the homeless system, they can actually find a tenant for her and make a managed move so that she's not leaving all of her possessions behind and not having to flee to the unknown. So there's a huge amount of work that's going to be able to happen at local level to make sure that we embed this policy in all the decisions that we're going to make in councils right up and down the country.
Thank you. Math, I'm so, yes. Martha, just something that maybe would help put this into context is that there's also a new proposal at Holyrood about some new courts being set up to deal with.
Is this the new sex crimes courts?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm kind of struggling with that phrase, to be honest. Anyway, have you any thoughts on that and how that might tie in or impact on the bill that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think this is there's a review by Justice Lady Dorian. Is it Lady Justice Dorian? I always get the Justice Dorian. We'll dispense with the archaic feudal titles. Justice Dorian chaired the review. It's a wide-ranging review into how sex crimes are dealt with in Scots law, and I believe one of the principal recommendations they've spoken about is having a specialist court specifically for sex crimes. I think that's probably, I mean, I'm no expert on the matter, Lady Dorian's a hugely respected jurist of decades of experience, and I'm just a bloke. I have no training in that. From what I can see from the recommendations, it seems to me to be a good idea to have this sort of specialist court where sex crimes can be considered in a unique way. I think one of the other recommendations was to ensure that sex crimes, the complainant, the victim, if you will, we call it complainant in Scots law, the complainant can submit evidence by record rather than live, so that they don't have to attend court, because Red Cross of Scotland will tell you the most traumatic time after the horrendous sexual assault they've endured is then having to relive the entire thing in open court with the abuser sitting right there in front of them, and a cross-examination from a defence lawyer. So it's having that sort of change, having them sorts of considerations brought in, making the language clearer, reducing some of the traditional archaic kind of robes and wigs sort of stuff that people think of when they say courts, to make it a less oppressive atmosphere for complainants to come forward for. That can only be a good thing. And these sorts of reviews, there's all sorts of problems around sex crime. We have very low prosecution rates in Scotland for sex crimes. Sex crimes across the world have very low prosecution rates, and part of that is the requirement for corroboration, an emphasis on the victim being the one that's causing a problem, that they're the reason why this is all happening, because they've gone to the police, they've made a big issue about this, as opposed to they've been raped, it's not they're not the fault, they're not the one to blame. So we need to end that kind of victim shaming, we need victim blaming nonsense, and having the courts approach this in a more sensitive way can only be a good thing.
Yes, lots of food for thought there, and Eleanor, is there anything that you want to say just before we leave that topic that you maybe think should be addressed or highlighted?
Yeah, I mean, Math covered it pretty well. When I was at university, I was subjected to a horrific sex attack that, I was re-traumatized by being forensically examined and then interviewed for hours by police. And in the back of my mind at that time, I was just desperate for there not to be anybody apprehended for it, because I really didn't want to face the court situation, and I knew would come, because that whole court situation re-traumatizes the complainant, and then in open court you're actually having to relive your trauma again. So this review that's come forward from Lady Dorian really holds a huge amount of again transformative stuff that we could do if it's taken forward. As Math said, being able to record your testimony, having an entire setup that's trauma informed. Not just in badging it as trauma informed, but actually in practice being trauma informed. So, as Matt said, removing some of that, archaic situation within the courts, making sure that somebody can give their testimony once and not have to be re-interviewed about it. Making sure that past sexual experience is not brought up, giving lifelong anonymity to the complainant, etc. So for me, this is a massive step forward, and you can actually knit everything we've been talking about previously into this as well. And again, it shows how progressive Scotland can be.
Yeah, it seems that all of these developments that are being brought in by Holyrood, I wonder if they would go so far as to describe them as common sense changes. But do you think? Yeah, do you think that, just trying to put this in an international context, I'm thinking about the changes, the recent news coming from Turkey about how it's withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention. Eleanor, do you think, is there a connection here between the changes that are being brought into Scotland in terms of sex abuse and courts and Turkey?
I mean, it's really entirely regrettable that, Turkey is the first signatory to the Istanbul Convention, has decided to withdraw under presidential decree this weekend, at a time where, femicide and attacks on women is increasing in Turkey at an alarming rate. And for me, it's this whole narrative that the conservative parts within Turkey are trying to say that this convention actually starts to remove the rights of the family and impinges on freedoms, etc. And for the fact that we're actually going to be bringing this into law in Scotland, it just shows you again, that sometimes when you have a progressive country, you actually can really affect great change. And the whole thing about Turkey removing and coming out of that this weekend just further outlines, I think, this narrative, this kind of lurch to the right that we're seeing across the world. And Scotland already has, really good standards in terms of the equally safe strategy about, protecting the rights of women and girls from abuse, and actually ratifying the convention. If we could get the UK to do it, because there's parts of it we can't do ourselves. If we could get the UK to actually fully sign, that would be fantastic. But I'm really, really dismayed for all the women and everybody in Turkey this weekend, because I think the news is just horrific.
Yes. Matt,
Yeah.
what about yourself? Have you got any thoughts on Turkey and developments there?
Yeah, it is very sad to see. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that doesn't see that Erdogan is, a dictator. He's taken Turkey from being one of the more moderate leading lights in the Middle East, pushing towards a more kind of European style secular democracy, and he's just dragging it straight back to the Middle Ages in some respects. The coup attempts that he's, got some involvement in orchestrating against his own government, and then claiming it was them just so he can push down on the opposition noises against him, the withdrawal from international treaties like the Istanbul Convention. I mean, the very name of it, Istanbul Convention. Turkey was the first to sign the damn thing, and now they're withdrawing from it. He's pushing towards that right extremism wing that's keeping him in power unjustly. So it's terribly sad to see for women across Turkey. And as Elena said, though, we've not got a perfect record on this ourselves. The UK signed the convention, I think, in 2014, and we've still not ratified it. Almost 12 years later, it's also 10 years later. We need to do better on these sorts of things. And as Elena said, Scotland can't ratify all of this ourselves. We can, certainly make sure that Scotland is compliant legally with the treaty, the convention on us. But we can't ratify it. It's up to the UK government. Come independence, obviously, I very much hope that Scotland signs and ratifies that convention, within days of independence. Obviously, there'll probably be some other things happening at that time, but it's the sort of thing that we can push forward on, and we should push forward on, regardless of the UK dragging its heels to stay stuck in the past.
Yes, sobering, to say the least. Moving on to a lighter topic, but in the form of good news, the recent news that the Scottish Parliament plans to nationalise Scotrail. As somebody who's a big user of public transport, for me, this is good to hear. Math, what do you think? Have you any thoughts? Any?
I'm trying to be careful in my scathing criticism of ScotRail here, because we all know what we think of ScotRail, but I think this is a good thing, because
that would be ScotRail
it's the sort of change that's needed now.
That would be ScotRail under the private sector, or.
I think that it's a good move. It's been a long time coming, I think, but for contractors it hasn't happened yet, obviously. I think that ScotRail being renationalised is a chance to take the service forward and operate it for public good rather than for private profit. At various stages it's been operated by different. I mean, Abellio, for instance, they're actually the owners, I believe, of the Dutch national rail system. So yeah, the Scottish rail fare is paying for better public services in Netherlands. Sorry, I almost said in Holland. I've got a friend from the Netherlands. You do not call the Netherlands Holland. No. It's very annoying. Yes, I think the move to nationalisation is a good idea. Renationalisation, let's say. I think that it's the sort of thing that for instance, like CalMac is a privately run company in many respects, but it's operated by the Scottish ministers. And if we're moving to that sort of model, I don't know all the details about the legal model that will be used. I suspect it'll be something similar to that. It'll be the chance to have a business plan sort of styled company that runs along business lines, but for the public good, for the good of the consumers. I mean, we have very high rail fares in Scotland. We have service levels that are not always the best. We have problems with the infrastructure as well. Now, the infrastructure, it's important to note the infrastructure is still run by Rail Track, which is a national rail. Sorry, it's just the responsibility of the Westminster Parliament at the moment. Still, so it's there are infrastructure problems that this will not solve, but it will allow us to run ScotRail itself for the public good rather than for private profit, which can only be a good thing, because these sorts of national services should never have been privatised in the first place. Bus services, rail services, public transport systems, public infrastructure systems, communications, utilities. These are all things that I think should be under government control, ran for the good of the people, not for private money. In England, we've seen what private utilities in England, for instance, are like, and it's just a mess. So having any public services being run for the public good can only be a good thing that everyone should welcome.
Thank you, Math. Elena, over to you. Do you think this is good news?
I think it's an absolutely fantastic announcement. As Math said as well, I think that we have to recognise that there's a huge part of the railway structures that we're still not in control of, and we're in fact awaiting a report that's been delayed many times from Westminster regarding the actual infrastructure of the railways right across the whole of the UK. Down here in Ayrshire, we're waiting for the electrification of the line from Kilmarnock up to Glasgow, which is a major project that has to be undertaken. And I think if we think about it in terms of the climate emergency that we're all living with at the moment, we need to make that shift, away from congestion in cars back into public transport. To be able to do that, we need to make sure that public transport is reliable and affordable, and that the connectivity issues there, and in terms of rural constituencies across the country are actually dealt with as well. So I think this is a massive big shift, and it signals, I think, the intentions of where we can go in an independent Scotland with things like renationalisation of the railways and other public bodies.
Yes. Again, another.
If I can come back in on that,
Sure,
John, just something I meant to say and add on, and Eleanor sort of pushed towards it there. The move to this, we should see this in terms of Scotland becoming independent in the next 4 to 5 years. I say 4 to 5 years before people on Twitter start blowing up at me. I mean fully independent, and all of the states of government and elections being finished, and we being a fully national, independent country. I think we're going to be having a referendum either later this year or early next year, 2 to 3 years of negotiations and set up time. So we're talking a 5-year time span. Scotland will be independent, I think, and in that, seeing it through that prism, getting control of ScotRail, getting that back into public hands, it allows us to start thinking, where are we going as an independent country? Where do we want our railways to be run for? At the moment, for instance, you've got the mad situation where we're trying to incentivise people to use public transport. We've got park and ride schemes where you have to pay to park. So you're actually already paying more than you would be just to use the car and drive to the city centre, to park outside the city centre and then get the train in. So it doesn't link up at all. It's madness. And it's things like that where a nationalised service run for public good is really going to be able to make strides as we try and move to this post-carbon economy. I know the Greens are very anti-car, incidentally. I'm not quite so anti-car. I'm anti-fossil fuel. To me, there's not much difference between a diesel-powered train and a diesel-powered car. Obviously, the diesel-powered car does put out some more pollution, but they're still both polluting. I think we need to move to a post-carbon world where we have electric cars and we have electrified train lines everywhere, and we do our very best with car sharing and ride sharing and train car services linking up with public transport being fully electrified. All of that, it needs to be seen holistically, because for instance, I don't have a train station near me. My nearest train station is a half-hour car drive. So there's always going to be a need for public and private transport stuff. But this is something we should see in the light of the independence that's coming in the next 3 to 4 5 years. Sorry.
Thank you for putting that into the context of the general situation in Scotland, and the constitutional question, as they say. And it sounds like maybe if any MSPs are listening, they should get in touch with UMass to feed your ideas into their plans for the nationalisation of Scotrail. Why not? Moving on to something maybe a little bit more sobering. So there have been dozens of arrests in London as thousands of people marched against COVID lockdowns, and this follows a recent rise in COVID numbers here in Scotland after Rangers fans took to the streets in an illegal gathering last week. And of course, there's a potential for more of that today with the Glasgow Rangers match on. I was listening to the radio before I came in, and I heard lots of recorded pleas by the football clubs for fans to stay at home. But going back to maybe the bigger UK-wide issue about the London marches, Math, have you any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I think it's very sad and I want to say regrettable, but it's more than regrettable. It's horrendously irresponsible that these marches have been allowed to take place. I do think it's striking, though. You know, the Metropolitan Police makes dozens of arrests, yeah, but they escort and happily allow a crowd of idiots, there's no other word for them, idiots, to traipse around the centre of London complaining about lockdown restrictions. And yet, you know, a couple of days before, there's a peaceful, silent vigil for a woman who was brutally murdered by a serving Metropolitan Police officer, and you saw women getting dragged across the pavement. This is the sort of policing that we thankfully very rarely see in Scotland, but we're not perfect, as we saw. You know, Police Scotland have some serious questions to answer about the Rangers gathering, jamboree, whatever you want to call it. The idiots that were out breaking the restrictions, and the police escorting them and taking selfies with them. This is not the sort of thing we need in a massive pandemic. Why the hell are these people out there doing it? You know, there's many responsible football fans stayed at home, enjoyed the results at home safely. These few idiots couldn't, and they need dealt with in that kind of light. I think this is. I mean, there's always going to be civic unrest when you have these sorts of massive restrictions. They are horrendous restrictions on civil liberties. No one can get away from that fact, but they're needed because there's a pandemic, and if we don't have these restrictions, more people will die, and that's the baseline that most people seem quite, you know, accepting of. That we can't have these sorts of mass gatherings, and that if we can all, you know, stay at home, stay safe, we'll get through this. And it's really frustrating. I think everyone would agree. It's really frustrating to see idiots out there causing these sorts of trouble, and then we see a resultant spike where people will die because they wanted to go out and, you know, have drinks and run around the streets like hooligans, and it's just not acceptable. It boils your blood, and then you see the police not arresting them. It just I'm going to stop because I get angry.
It is quite troubling to watch these news reports, and I think it does seem to be the case that this kind of behaviour is going to risk us being able to come out of lockdown sooner. Elena, Math highlighted the difference in how the Metropolitan Police seem to handle different groups of people on the streets for different reasons. Do you think, is there any way that, I mean, how it is a difficult situation, but how could the authorities perhaps standardise? Is that the right word? How they handle large gatherings of people in a time of a pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's a huge balancing act that they've got to do, because you've got to try and weigh up, you know, people's right, as Matt said. You know, we have this real and fundamental right of the right to protest, but how can you safely do a pandemic? The answer is you can't really. You know, you can try and you know, use social distancing measures, make sure you're wearing masks, and we saw that in the Black Lives Matter protests that we had up and down the country, and as the pandemic first started. But again, there was a perceived heavy-handed reaction by the police at that time. I was really incensed as I watched, the candlelight and women being dragged across the floor, and that iconic picture of that woman with the flaming red hair and the defiance in her eyes is something that I think I'm not going to ever forget. There is an absolute uptick in terms of the numbers of cases after we had Rangers fans celebrating within Glasgow, especially within the police. So there's been, the police that were involved that day in policing that event. Some of them have tested positive. We've now got about 36 police officers self-isolating because of that. The people that were protesting against lockdown measures are probably, increased their chance of getting out and protesting because of the policing bill. So the policing bill is actually bringing in quite draconian measures in terms of blocking people's right to protest. But how you balance that in a pandemic where you're actually going to build bridges between people who are in close proximity for that virus to spread is a really difficult measure. I understand that police on the ground are facing a very difficult decision as to how they police something and how they don't make something, explode into an even more of a situation. But I think if we compare and contrast what we've seen over the last few weeks and how certain events have been policed, I think there's questions that need to be asked and we need to have some answers round about them, because there seems to be a disparity there.
Yes, and I think that uptick in the number of, or not an uptick, but the fact that some of those police officers did contract COVID, possibly due to their working conditions, it shows that we just all have to still be careful. So thank you for that, Elena. Moving on, another item in the news that's makes me smile when I shouldn't say it, but Boris Johnson's £200,000 flat redesign. Math, I'm sorry. Sorry. Math.
You're getting someone in your ear talking there.
I'm so sorry. I'm so easily distracted. So yeah, Boris Johnson's £200,000 flat redesign has been in the news a lot recently. What do you think about that? Have you seen the colour scheme, or?
When I'm not doing politics, I'm a graphic designer. I'm not great at interior design, as the backdrop will show, but honest to God, 200 grand. I know some guys that do paint and decorating on the side. I'm sure they could have done it for a bit less, and they wouldn't have chose such awful gaudy colours. But
apparently, it's the wall.
No, I think.
Apparently, it's the wallpaper that's the biggest cost of wallpaper's the luxury item, I'm told.
Wallpaper. Yeah, I would have just gone with white emulsion, to be honest. These sorts of things. I mean, sure, these stories get lots of. I think it was Open Democracy that broke it. I think that the Electoral Commission are right to look into these things. If there's been spending that's that falls under the regime that the Commission regulate, then it needs to take action. It needs to crack down to make sure that there's not illegal spending, to make sure there's not spending by dark money, I think is the name of it. The spending by offshore accounts from Panama by Tory grandees or the like. It's nonsense. And the worst thing about this is, though, it's not a story about bad interior design or how much money is spent, because sometimes when you're talking about government facilities or government flats and stuff, the costs are always going to be more because everyone has to get security checked, everyone has to undergo more sorts of there's more requirements to listed building. You've got to make sure that for instance, if you're putting up wallpaper, you check that it's not bugged. That happened in America. The Russian embassy got bugged because they put up new wallpaper. These sorts of things always cost more, but at the same time, that's not actually the story here. The story is that there's dark money possibly being involved in government buildings and stuff like that, with Boris Johnson being the recipient of them, presumably. That's the sort of thing that needs investigating. The real problem here is the Electoral Commission are going to say they're going to investigate it and do what? That's the problem. The Electoral Commission, it seems like they have no teeth. They don't ever, they'll do investigations and then nothing comes of it. The worst that might happen is that someone might get an official, don't do that again, please. It's pointless. Yeah. A fine that's the cost of doing business. It's that sort of thing that just needs to really get drilled down to. Of course, it won't, though, because the media will focus on the colour scheme and possibly even where the money comes from, but they'll never actually focus on getting some sort of justice or rectification of how this happens. Because the media, the people, you talk about it's in the Times and the Mail. Oh, really? Who are they owned by? These are sorts of things that no one ever talks about. And that's the problem here. It doesn't ever get focus on the actual problem. It always focuses on the tabloidy, gaudy colour schemes. It's nonsense.
Thanks for that. Excuse me. I think you've done a really good job there in kind of getting to...
Sorry, Elena.
No, really, because you're absolutely right. Elena, have you got anything to add to Matt's very useful comments there about it's rather than... Sorry, on
just
you go.
just very briefly on it. I mean, I think it's the £200,000 supposed cost overall is sometimes understandable in terms of things that Matt outlined. I think it's the £60,000 dark money question roundabout. Payments to a peer and the Tory party is the issue that the Electoral Commission is having to look at. And again, we see Rees Moggs, saying that the commission can't be trusted, basically. But it's operating out with the realms of what it's supposed to do, and I think that doesn't help either. Whether the commission itself doesn't have enough teeth to do anything concrete at the end of any investigation, but actually the Tory party trying to get the narrative roundabout that the commission shouldn't be trusted anyway in the first place. To me, there's an issue there. It would be interesting to know what size of flags that maybe Carrie Symonds has commissioned for number 10. That might be an interesting fact to find out.
Yeah, I think you're both doing a really good job in unpacking what often is just a knee-jerk headline. Seems very simple, but actually when you look into it and begin to unpack it and you realise that there's a lot of factors to be considered and influencing outcomes, all just
I know if I was asking the Electoral Commission or Jacob Rees-Mogg, I know who I'd trust more.
No
doubt.
What can I say? We're a little bit ahead, but I'm tempted to move on to the next topic because Hugh Edwards and his giant Welsh flag, do you think maybe that could be a solution for what we were just talking about, the redecoration of Downing Street? Maybe they should just get a giant flag or something. But Hugh Edwards, who should we go to first? Elena.
I went first last time.
Right, okay.
And
I'll go first on this one. I think if we look at what happened with regards to the BBC Breakfast programme, where this was first discussed, Naga Munchetty did say there's always a flag, and her co-host, had that tongue-in-cheek quip that he said about, the size of the housing minister's Jenric's flag behind him. I think for me what was interesting is actually the amount of abuse that as a woman she took afterwards, where there was no abuse directed really at her co-host who actually started it.
That was quite telling, wasn't it, Elena?
It was really telling. She got it because she couldn't stifle her laugh, and then she talked about there always being a flag. And then I think the BBC, the new chief Director General came forward, and I think he's got he came in on a charger that was saying, I'm going to stamp out the left-wing bias that he sees as being in the BBC. So I think the whole Flaggate thing, with then Hugh coming in with his Welsh flag on his tweet, which was, satirical according to him. He was doing it in a tongue-in-cheek way and then being directed to remove it. it actually just exacerbates the question and gives, it just makes it look pretty stupid. The only flag that's allowed is the Union flag, it seems to be. And for me, it's just, it's a nonsense, really. And, I don't know what Math's got to say about it, but, I think it's pretty regrettable that you can't use, whatever your devolved nation's flag is, your country's flag, and in any way that you want. But I think the bigger fundamental issue is that everything seems to be stamped with a union flag at the moment, and it seems to be the bigger the flag, the better the flag.
Yes, and Math, there's one easy way to find out what Math thinks, and that's just to ask him. Math, I
Yeah,
don't. I had a thought and it's gone, so maybe I should just say, Math, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the thing is, flags. Every time people talk about flags, I think about that the Northern Irish comedy show. I forget the name of it. The Flags routine. Yeah, I'm not going to go any further on that one, but yeah, it always makes me kind of laugh. People get really wound up about flags and stuff. I mean, I've got a couple of flags sitting around here. I've got my English flag. I've got an English Scots for yes flag, which is the same. It's just got a big yes in one corner. Really riles up the Unionists, that one. I've got dozens of
there's nothing
saltires,
wrong with
and I've even got
flags per se, is there? But I don't want to interrupt you, but when you mentioned a comedy show, when I heard or watched the Naga and our colleague said, "Oh, that's a really small flag," and it reminded me of Father Ted, and I was like, "No, it's just far away." But so sorry, I'll be quiet now and let you finish your thoughts.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, it's the whole thing. I mean, what is the name of that Northern Irish comedy? Flags routine. The Flags routine. What is the name of that? It's a Northern Irish comedy routine that's really quite iconic. It talks about it. What was the name of that again?
Is it the Irish comedian who plays each of the nations that make up the United Kingdom in turn?
The Blame Game. It's the Blame Game. That's I
else.
just googled it in the background there. If you've not seen it, Google the Blame Game flags. People get wound up about these things, and I understand. Flags are important. They're a symbol of your nation. They're a symbol of patriotism in some ways. Although I think that people hide behind them a lot instead of answering big questions. The real question here is the bias, as you said, the bias of the BBC towards that union. Tim Davies has come in. He's obviously got this thing about defending the union. It's this whole push against devolved nations. Even the phrase devolved nations. We're not devolved, we're nations. Power has been devolved to some of the nations in the UK and we're going independent. But the phrase devolved nations is itself this kind of putting down slur. And the BBC have had this agenda for some time that they want to push the union and get rid of this any hint of dissent. So everything that's got the UK flag in it is great, and anything that's not is rubbish. That's just their kind of attitude. So obviously her criticism of that was going to have the corporations pushing against her. And Hugh Edwards tweeting out his Welsh flag and then getting told to take it down. That's just symbolic of it. You're allowed a flag as long as it's a British one. That's the mantra at the BBC.
Yeah, I suppose we would all agree that flags have their uses, but the images that are coming to mind for me are, I think we all remember Nigel Farage and his colleagues that last day in the Parliament in the European Union when they were all waving their little Union Jacks and they were asked to put them away. It's... I
think the interesting thing about that... Oh, sorry, Elena, I'll shut up.
I was just going to say, I think, one of the bigger things behind all of this, if you think about, there was a Tory MP this week, I think her name's Lion Nicky, who said, you love the flag and you love the Queen or you move to another country. So there's actually another narrative round about this that's maybe not as flippant, as it first seems. There's that underlying current about the only flag that we all should be supporting as the Union flag, and that's very dangerous. There's a dangerous narrative behind that.
Yes,
I'd agree. It's that kind of it's British nationalism run rampant. It's that kind of idea that everything British is great and anything that's not is rubbish. And if you're not liking the British flag, if you're not liking the British government, if you don't like the UK government, if you don't like the Tories, you see how that slippery slope started at a very almost reasonable of you've got to love the country you live in, right, to you must support Boris Johnson or you're a traitor and you can get out of the country. That's the slippery slope of fascism. That's how they get them.
Yeah.
That's how you take a reasonably democratic country all the way down to a fascist dictatorship, is that cult of personality around the instruments of the state, and then the instruments of the government, and then the instruments of the party, and then the instruments of the leader. It's that kind of funnel effect that they're pushing at. And Elena's exactly right about that. That's why it's so dangerous. That's why it's not really that flippant. They're trying to push the Union flag.
Yes, my country, right or wrong, and then you're probably not very far away from might is right and those kind of scary situations. We're getting close to the end of the show, so thank you, Elena, and thank you, Math, for your insightful contributions today, and thank you for being here with us on a lovely Sunday. Hopefully sunny where you are, day.
Yep, it is.
Is it good? I'm pleased. So you'll be able to go out and enjoy it soon, socially distanced, of course. So here at Broadcasting Scotland, you probably know that we're currently in the midst of a fundraiser. It takes money to do everything that we do here. I'm looking around the room at all the kit and the monitors and the cameras and the cables and the lights. So if you can contribute, if you have any spare funds at all, no matter how small, please consider sending them to Broadcasting Scotland's way. And of course, if that's not the case, then there's room here for lots of volunteers, which I can attest to that. So maybe think about just letting us have some of your time. So thank you for watching, and thank you to our contributors, and we'll see you all next week.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.